The gut is not Vegas, and things that are happening in the gut don't stay in the gut. The more that we learn about how microbes in our gut are influencing very far distant organs, including things like the kidneys, the brain, the lungs, you name it, we have to start thinking about how to incorporate some of these products into our practice.
Hello, Vetfolio Voice listeners. Welcome back. I am absolutely thrilled to have you here for this episode, which is sponsored by Hills and features my favorite person to talk about all things poop with, and that's Dr. Janessa Winston. You know, for those of us in this profession, I feel like having that person, that go-to person to talk about poop with is essential. You know, there's just a lot of that involved in what we do. But really, the focus of our conversation today was not specifically poop, but more the gut microbiome, because as we're learning more and more, the microbiome is the source of so much incredible information related to our patients' overall health. And in this conversation, we dove into more about what we know so far, the vast amount of information that is still out there that we're trying to wrap our heads around, and what that might mean for the future of medicine in general, and certainly the future of veterinary medicine and how we manage our patients. Now, if you're anything like me, you got out of school, whether it was vet school or tech school, and while we were in school, we learned about prebiotics and probiotics in terms of what they were and maybe how they impacted overall digestion, but not so much their role in overall patient health. And even if we had learned more in school, our knowledge on this specific topic is expanding so rapidly that I think we would all use an update even if we felt pretty confident on all of that information coming out of school. Dr. Winston and I dove into some of the newer concepts that we're talking about, including the term postbiotics, which was a term that was new to me. And so we certainly got into the definitions of these terms, but also expanded on their role in impacting overall health. And we look at how our understanding of the gut and the microbiome is impacting our approach to chronic disease processes, things like inflammatory bowel disease, chronic kidney disease, and even skin and behavior. We got into a little bit of a vet school refresh of thinking beyond what microbes are present in a healthy gut to asking more about why are these microbes there? What is the function that they are actually performing? And what happens if certain beneficial bacteria are no longer part of the gut ecosystem? And how we can restore not just the presence of a certain microbe, but also its critical functionality. The truth is, this is still such a budding area of research. You'll hear the excitement in our conversation because we're truly just scratching the surface here. And even with our current, surface level, for lack of a better word, understanding, we're already finding ways to make major therapeutic impacts. And so you'll hear us talk about, imagining what this will look like in 5, 10, 15 years. It's a whole new field of medicine that's unlocking therapeutic options that maybe we could only conceptualize before. Super exciting conversation, incredibly interesting. Dr. Winston does a great job of breaking down such a complex topic with so many moving parts into a very understandable conversation that's easy to wrap your head around. So without further ado, let me go ahead and introduce her, and we will get into the ever-evolving world of the gut microbiome. Dr. Janessa Winston is an assistant professor at The Ohio State University. She received her Bachelor's of Science in Integrated Biology from the University of Florida in 2007. She then received her veterinary degree from North Carolina State University in 2011. She went on to complete a rotating small animal internship and residency in small animal internal medicine at North Carolina State, achieving board certification as a diplomate in the American College of Veterinary Internal Medicine in 2015. As a clinical investigator and NIH T32 fellow at NC State, Dr. Winston completed a PhD in comparative biomedical sciences with an infectious disease concentration in 2019. As a clinician scientist, Dr. Winston's primary research areas of interest include microbe-host interactions during health and disease. She has a special interest in microbially derived bile acids and rational manipulation of microbial ecosystems during interventions such as fecal microbiota transplantation. Dr. Winston is chair of the International Companion Animal FMT Consortium, which is developing clinical guidelines for FMT. Since starting at The Ohio State University, Dr. Winston has launched the Companion Animal Fecal Bank, which serves as a unique research platform to accelerate our study and translation of microbial community sciences into safe and effective clinical application. Her laboratory is currently conducting 2 FMT clinical trials for feline obesity and canine parvovirus enteritis. In addition to Dr. Winston's veterinary microbiome research, she's also recipient of an NIH NIAID KO8 award focused on defining the role of the gut microbiota and microbially derived secondary bile acids in conferring susceptibility and contributing to the severity of C. difficile infection during intestinal inflammation caused by inflammatory bowel disease. As you can see, she is quite the authority on all of this subject matter. Let's go ahead and get into our episode with Dr. Janessa Winston.
Microbiome science is a swiftly evolving field that has caught the attention of pet owners. Are you prepared to answer their questions? NAVC's brand new veterinary microbiome certification course will give you the skills to implement microbiome science in your daily practice and improve patient care. New research shows maintaining a balanced gut microbiome is vital for optimal nutrition, disease prevention, and longevity in pets. Register today on vetfolio.com.
Well, I'm super excited to be joined once again by Dr. Janessa Winston, who is, one of the leading people talking about microbiome and the importance and FMT and all of this stuff. So, Janessa, thank you so much for joining me again. I'm really excited for this conversation. I always learn a ton when we talk about this stuff.
Thanks so much for having me. Yeah, we always have fun talking about all the microbes, and so I'm excited to be back again.
Yes, absolutely. I was just saying, I'm like, who knew poop could be so fun? But it's so interesting. Let's start at the beginning, kind of breaking this down, talking about prebiotics, probiotics, and postbiotics. I feel like I have a decent handle at this point on prebiotics and probiotics, not so much postbiotics, and even like the pre and pro. I don't, and maybe this is just me, I don't feel like I left vet school confident in what those were. It wasn't until, I got additional education years after graduating vet school that I went, okay, I understand what these are, and I'm still totally lost when it comes to postbiotics. So I'm going to hand that one over to you and ask you if you could break that down for us.
Yeah, absolutely. Do we have like 3 hours to talk about all these?
Seriously.
So I think part of why we don't capture this as much in the veterinary curriculum is just these are such complex topics that take a lot of time to go through. So really just to recap the basics. So a prebiotic is any source of food that we're giving to microbes. So whether that's a fiber source or other nutrient that's going to be utilized by the microbes within your gut, as opposed to a probiotic is going to be more of a collection either of multiple organisms that we're putting into the GI tract or even just a single organism. And we tend to talk about the bacteria here when we're talking about probiotics, but the truth is it could be any microorganism. So there's even some new yeast-based products that are available on the veterinary market. So that's where these fit into that category of you're giving microbes in order to try and get them to confer a health benefit for the patient. And then postbiotics, they are confusing. And I will tell you on the human side, there's the International Scientific Association of Prebiotics and Probiotics, ISAP, and they basically have put out very strict definitions of what these things are in order to try and advance scientific discovery and research on them. And the long and the short was I learned postbiotics as actually being like microbial metabolites and thinking of it that way. But recently the definition has changed to more it's microorganisms that are no longer alive. So it's separate from a probiotic where we're talking about them going in and being alive and having a function in an ecosystem, and more about components of them. So like their cell wall or other enzymes within them that could activate a host response, especially an immune response. And so It's a little bit different than when we're just thinking about, okay, short chain fatty acids are important, so we're going to give those as postbiotics. Some people are still using that as the definition, but in a purest sense, really a postbiotic is you're giving either a microorganism that's no longer alive or a component of it in order to confer a health benefit.
So different from a probiotic where you are giving something that's alive, you're giving something that's not alive, and the metabolism of whatever it is that you're giving is going to trigger some sort of theoretically desirable host response.
Yeah, and it might not even be the metabolism. It might be that, the host, as we know in the gut, there's immune surveillance that's happening in the background. And so if you put in a portion of a cell wall of a microorganism, it may actually change what's happening and being sensed by that host and could be beneficial. So remember, our immune system is detecting pathogens, but also good microbes and changing physiology based on that.
Oh my goodness, I see why we need 3 hours. I have
Yes.
so many, like, I feel like I could just sit here, we could talk just about postbiotics, and we still wouldn't wrap it up in the time frame that we have.
No. And then the other term that gets thrown out a lot, and I think a lot of the food companies are starting to push this more, is the idea of symbiotics, where we're basically taking a prebiotic and a probiotic and we're putting them together. So there are some companies that have started to put out products that have kind of like, let's say, a fiber source with a collection of microorganisms so that you have this symbiotic component. And it kind of makes sense when you think about it. If you're putting microorganisms into an ecosystem, they've got to have nutrients in order to survive there. And so by putting the two together, that can be very synergistic for trying to make sure that that organism is going to be successful within the gut. And so some of the diets that are produced by food companies are actually designed to try and optimize growth of some of these probiotics that are on the market too. So I think that's another component to think about is when we look at products across the veterinary landscape, there are a lot of symbiotic products that are coming up that even our clients are using that we may not even be aware of.
Sure. And so just to make sure I'm still following what you're saying correctly, using these symbiotics where we have a fiber source combined with a probiotic, that's kind of our prebiotic component. Yeah, where it's this fiber source is
You got it.
feeding our
Yep.
microbiome, and then we're adding in the live organisms as well. And that's why we're seeing a lot of focus on fiber, a lot of addition of fiber into different diets.
Yeah. The way I explain it to vet students is if you're going on a long trip, like let's say you're going to hike the Appalachian Trail, right? And you're through hiking, you're going to bring food with you, right? Because you're not sure what you're going to find along the way, if anything, right? Well, we're trying to do the same thing for microbes with symbiotics. We want to make sure that they have an energy source in order to make sure that they're successful on their journey.
Okay, okay, that makes sense. I still feel like we've barely scratched the surface, but in broad concepts, in broad strokes, that makes a lot of sense to me that we have kind of our nutrient source for our live organisms, we have our live organisms, and then we have different components of what maybe once was live organisms or something like that that is triggering an immune response in some way, shape, or form. Prebiotic, probiotic, postbiotic. Say that 5 times fast. Uh, so when we're thinking about these, and I'm sure this is going to also be in broad strokes because I can see how detailed all of this is and how much there is to this just in the whatever 5 or 10 minutes we've been talking. What role in general are the different components playing in overall health?
Yeah, so this gets back to how important our microbiomes are in general, right? So I think we tend to talk about how microbes help us to digest our foods and release nutrients, how they help us to maintain our overall glucose metabolism, how they help with our immune response, et cetera. But the truth is, the list goes on and on and on of all the beneficial components that microbes play for us. And when we think about overall health, I tend to kind of break it into two big categories. One is focused on GI health, which I'm a gastroenterologist, so everything is focused in the gut, right? But gut health is extremely important. And, especially when you look at cases that veterinarians are managing in private practice and in the general practice setting, we see a lot of patients that have underlying dysfunction within their GI tracts. And so sometimes we're leveraging these prebiotics and probiotics and even postbiotics to really just confer a health benefit to the gut. And whether that's supporting kind of reestablishment of a more healthy ecosystem, so reaching for a probiotic to try and get those members members in, or whether I think the members are there, but that maybe they're not as robust as they need to be. And so I'm more worried about their resilience. I might try to support them on the dietary side of picking a prebiotic. I think one of the diets that I tend to reach for when I'm thinking about this in mind is Hill's GI Biome. So that diet is based on science and it really is designed to try and support microbes and feed microbes to promote overall health. I think the postbiotic part is still a little bit more challenging to figure out how to get into clinical practice just yet with thinking about gut health. But I think that the gut in general, not only are we trying to maintain that ecosystem, but then this feeds back into what's happening with the immune response at the level of the epithelium. Really important is thinking about overall intestinal permeability and those tight junctions. So our microbes play a really important role in preventing leaky gut. And so sometimes that's my target, and that's what I want to try to impact in the gut. And so when we talk about these, really the focus has been really on the gut, but I'm starting to think about things outside the gut. So Rob Knight, one of the leading microbiome experts in the world, I remember him saying during my grad school at a talk, he used to say that the gut is not Vegas and things that are happening in the gut don't stay in the gut. And he's absolutely right. The more that we learn about how microbes in our gut are influencing very far distant organs, including things like the kidneys, the brain, the lungs, you name it, we have to start thinking about how to incorporate some of these products into our practice of not just impacting and not just thinking about gut health, but really thinking about how gut health is going to maintain overall physiology for that patient.
And that's what I think is so exciting when we're learning about all of this. One of my first experiences kind of delving into the gut as a therapeutic target and just the type of role that it plays in overall health had to do with talking about supplements that we can use in kidney disease to target. We're targeting the gut, but we're influencing kidney disease. And it just really like it blew my mind when I thought about it because I went, oh my gosh, here's a whole nother therapeutic target for this disease that, sometimes you just feel like you've hit a brick wall and there's nothing else you can do. And now we can just target a whole different body system. And it kind of, yeah, like I said, it blew my mind. And it really put me in a mindset of just keeping an open mind to all the different things that are still out there to discover about how the gut is influencing the rest of the body. And I think it's really interesting. It's really exciting. So I think what I'm hearing you say, like you said, the gut is not Vegas, things don't stay there, is how do these play a role in overall health? In so many ways and in ways that we've really yet to even truly figure out at this point. I also thought it was interesting that you talked about microbes being essential when it comes to tight junction. Because when we think about translocation, we're worried about the microbes getting out of the gut, but actually a healthy gut microbiome might actually be keeping the bacteria in the gut where we want it to be and helping to prevent translocation, like all these things. It's just, there's so much there.
Yeah, and another thing that I think we don't talk about a ton because we're like so focused on the microbes, a lot of how they are communicating and talking with the host and talking to the cells themselves is through metabolites. So those microbes are taking metabolites that are within the lumen of the gut and they are biotransforming them into metabolites that are then recognized by the host. So some of those are recognized at the level of the epithelial cells in the gut, but a lot of those metabolites are the ones that we're talking about that have far-reaching impacts. And chronic kidney disease is one of those big areas. My group has been working on that with Jess Quimby as well, trying to look at some of these microbial metabolites and how if they're disrupted and there's disruption in the gut, they may be perpetuating or even leading to exacerbation of that underlying chronic kidney disease state. And so, yeah, there's a lot more opportunity when we start to open up new windows for CKD patients of thinking about how important it is that we're modulating their microbiome as part of that disease.
Yeah, yes, all of that. You said it in a way more concise and intelligent way than I did, and it makes so much sense. It's so exciting. So let's keep going a little bit more down that road. When we're thinking, you mentioned chronic kidney disease, there's a lot of disease states that can cause dysbiosis. Certainly, I'll throw it out there. I'm also a big fan of GI Biome. I've had a lot of success with my own dog with that diet, and he's done really well on that. So when we're thinking about dysbiosis in various disease states, how is that varying from one disease state to another? Are we how much variation, I guess, are we saying, like case to case, patient to patient?
Sure. So let's start with what is dysbiosis, if people don't know. So, yeah, so dysbiosis, all that means is that there's an imbalance in the microbes within that ecosystem. And in vet med, in the literature at least, what that's really focused on is like who is changing. So, more like a census, level of, okay, microbe X is high in this disease and it's low in this disease. It's very just taking a census of what the microbial community looks like within a disease state. And because dysbiosis is a single word, I feel like veterinarians in general, and I think probably just people in general, we simplify it and think that that's like one state, right? Like a dysbiotic state in the gut. It happens, and it's one collection of organisms, and this is how it looks. And the truth is that as we start to characterize more and more states of dysbiosis in dogs and cats, we are finding that dysbiosis and that state, that consensus data of who's there, it changes with the diseases. And that's really not unexpected. Like that's what we see on the human side too. But it does make it a little bit more challenging when we think about how we're going to change a dysbiotic state to one of eubiosis or a more balanced, healthy state. And that's been a struggle. And I think honestly, part of that has been kind of the Achilles heel of microbiome science in general. This is across vet med and human med, is really trying to get away from just associations of microbes being, increased or decreased in certain diseases, and really trying to figure out like if microbe X goes down, what function are we losing in that ecosystem that isn't getting replaced? Because it's really the functional output that means the most. And so this is complicated when you're thinking about this from a veterinary standpoint of how do I clinically manage patients then? When we think about managing dysbiosis, there might not be a one size fits all, right? So there are some general concepts that we can take when we're dealing with, a situation. Let's say a patient has a urinary tract infection and they need to go on antimicrobial, making sure that that animal is on a good commercially available diet or a well-balanced diet that that supports gut microbe health is going to be one critical step to promoting resilience among a healthy community. And then when we start to think about, well, can I reach in that state for a probiotic? Absolutely, you can. But then what I would say is it depends on what you're going to reach for. So some of it depends on what antibiotic you select and who we think is going to get depleted from that ecosystem, right? And so on the veterinary market, we have a variety of probiotics that we can reach for. But what I would say is they're not all created equal. And even though we, may say, okay, if I treat with an antibiotic, I know there's a dysbiosis. If I have a dog who has chronic inflammatory enteropathy, I know that there's a dysbiosis. If I have a dog who has parvoviral mediated diarrhea, I know there's a dysbiosis. If I have CKD, I know that there's a dysbiosis. I won't be able to reach on the shelf and pick just one probiotic to get all of those different diseases because every single one of those looks different in the microbial community. And so that makes this hard as a clinician. Of what do you pick and how do you do that? We could spend an entire lifetime investigating this, this topic and trying to tease it apart. So I think for me, when I take that microbiome science and I try and translate it into microbiome medicine and looking at it from a patient perspective, that's where it gets a little bit more challenging. And we need to start to have more evidence-based recommendations for how to utilize all these tools, all these microbiome medicine tools that we now have available in vet med.
Yes, you could probably see from my face there when you said this is complicated. Yeah, my face definitely was probably expressing like, oh gosh, like where do we go here? And on the one hand, I think it is still that really exciting place because there's just so much to uncover here. And I think of how it could really change a lot of the ways that we're approaching different disease states. However, I think you did a great job of illustrating how much there is still to uncover. Not only if we remove the microbe, then maybe we should replace the microbe, but what actually is happening there and how can we target the functional endpoint as opposed to just if this microbe's gone, we put it back in. I guess I would wonder from a clinical perspective, we think of if we have, say in the state of sepsis or something like that, we might say broad spectrum, four quadrant antibiotic therapy. Is that at this point, with what we know so far about microbiome medicine, and I like that you distinguished microbiome science and microbiome medicine because those do feel different. Is there rationale for saying, just a broad spectrum option, so to speak?
Yeah, so I think again, this comes back to our job is to do no harm, right? But we also want to make sure that we're trying to support health as best as we can. So in a septic patient, absolutely you need broad spectrum antimicrobial coverage. I hate to say I'm not thinking about the microbes in that case, but 100% I'm putting the patient's needs ahead of supporting microbiome health. So I know that when I'm giving and prescribing those broad spectrum antibiotics, I am causing collateral damage to that ecosystem. And so things that I think about are one, nutritional support is going to be key, not only for that patient's overall health, but to support the microbiome in the best way that I can. And that's to try and make sure that that patient's getting high quality food for sure. The other component is, if I want to reach for a probiotic, just because honestly, it will make me feel better that we're doing something, right? I do tend to lean in those scenarios to multi-strain probiotics. If you think about non-specifically collateral damage to that ecosystem, kind of the best thing would be a multi-strain probiotic. And we didn't really talk about it yet too much, but this is also where things like fecal transplant actually may fit in even better because if you're having broad damage to the microbiome using fecal transplant where we're taking feces from a healthy individual, it's going to include not just components of bacteria, but it's going to have bacteriophage or viruses, protozoa, archaea, all sorts of organisms that we're impacting in various disease states. It also has some postbiotic components because not all those organisms are alive, but maybe FMT is where that needs to come into play more. The problem is I can't point to a paper for you that says, here's how to use the, FMT in a septic patient, right? Probably the biggest piece of evidence that I have is for parvo. And we know that if you give fecal transplant in viral mediated diarrhea like parvo, it can shorten hospitalization. That's been shown in an unblinded study. And actually, within my lab, we have recently presented and are submitting here shortly evidence that we can reduce hospitalization length in parvo puppies by giving them fecal transplant. So absolutely, I think, you know, in depending on what dysbiotic state you have, really dictates what type of product we're thinking about. And I think I practice evidence-based medicine, and I think the hard thing and why I hedge so much in this space to say this is exactly what you should do is I don't always have the evidence yet.
That might kind of lead to my follow-up question here, which less so probiotics in the context of sepsis and broad spectrum antibiotics, more so in the standpoint of I'm dealing with a disease state that has known dysbiosis, whether it's chronic kidney disease or chronic enteropathy or something like that. And there isn't the specific science available at this point to say this is what I need to reach for in this case in this patient. Would it be reasonable at that point to say reach for what we have on the shelf, our broad spectrum products that like you said, kind of like with FMT, where we do have prebiotics, we have probiotics. Perhaps in the case of some of these yeast based ones, we have some postbiotic components and things like that. At this point, with where the science stands, is that kind of the best approach, or is there a different way to think about those cases?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fair to think about doing that, right? I think the likelihood of you causing harm is probably pretty low. The likely of you causing a benefit, though, I think is hard for me to predict, right?
Fair. Yeah, that makes sense.
And sometimes I think it's important too that we think about microbiome medicine is so individual. Every individual has such a unique microbiome that even if, like, let's say we take chronic enteropathy, for example, we know that a large portion of those dogs have a dysbiosis. Like, I don't need to do any diagnostics to tell you the majority of those dogs are going to be dealing with an imbalance in that ecosystem, right? And so I know that I'm going to have to try and support that in some way. But how an animal responds is so individual. So there's papers that show that using some multi-strain probiotic like Visbiome can be beneficial in in some of those patients. But I know as an internist, sometimes I reach for that and it does nothing, right? We know that diet plays such a big role in that disease, right? The majority of cases of chronic enteropathy as a specialist, I never see because, veterinarians are treating them in general practice with modulating diet. And we used to think about diet in that case of really being focused on the host and trying to limit antigens because of the host response. But now we're finding that some diets that support the microbiome health actually can help patients with chronic enteropathy. So we see fiber responsive animals where really giving them fiber is what they need to control their chronic enteropathy signs. And this is where, either supplementing fiber or using a product that has moderate fiber can be beneficial. And so that's like very different, thought of why you're prescribing a diet is really you're targeting that microbiome health. And so I think, this landscape is kind of ever changing. I think in chronic enteropathy, there's been multiple publications out now by Linda Torreson about using fecal transplant. And so I have all these tools for microbiome medicine now in my toolbox for chronic enteropathy. Yet the thing as a clinician I struggle with the most is I have no way to predict which patients are going to respond to what. And so I think that's where the next level of microbiome science is going, is trying to help us to how do we design diagnostic tools to help clinicians pick, do I pick a probiotic? Do I pick focus on diet and prebiotic, or do I need to do something like a fecal transplant? And I hope over my career we'll get there so that clinicians can make more educated decisions about what to pick from their microbiome medicine toolkit. But right now, like I think if you picked any of those options for a chronic enteropathy patient, it's a trial and error. And you're going to have some patients that respond to the probiotic and some that respond to FMT and some that need, diet and a probiotic and a steroid. It's so patient specific still, but I don't think that precludes us from trying to modulate the microbiome.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. I'm thinking about it, and like the idea of a future where it's not trial and error just seems so like foreign to me. I'm like, yeah, it's trial and error. I talk to clients about that. I say, I'm going to make my best guess, but I might not get the category of diet right on the first try, or we may have to, go these different routes and try these
Yeah.
different things. Like I guess if we can jump into the science a little bit more, can you talk a little bit more about how that type of research is approached, some of the challenges it presents, and I guess and I think the answer is that you're kind of working towards this. Do you see a future where we can start to assess patients on an individual level and really tailor those recommendations to whatever flavor of dysbiosis we're presented with in that specific patient?
Yeah, I mean, you just summarized my vision for where microbiome medicine and microbiome science and
Seems too
vet
good to be
med
true.
needs to go. Yeah, you're speaking it into truth for sure. So, yeah, that's exactly where vet med needs to go. And these aren't efforts that can just be done by like my lab, right? Like there are so many labs across the entire globe that are focused on trying to do this right now. And I think we're also leveraging information from the human side because this is also kind of the next big wave of precision medicine on the human side too. And so hopefully as there's translational discoveries that happen, we can also pull those into vet med and potentially have vet med ones be translational in the other direction too. But there are challenges in veterinary medicine for overcoming microbiome studies. So in all of us, this isn't a surprise to anyone. When you look at the sample sizes that we get for veterinary studies, they're small, right? We're reading papers where we're talking about making decisions off of 20 to 40 dogs, right? And then all of us are going to adopt that practice into management. The Parvo paper that I'm writing right now, like we have 27 dogs, but I'm asking you, to change your clinical practice based on the results of these dogs, right? So very small sample sizes. In human medicine, we're talking about hundreds of subjects, right? And so when we think about the microbiome, if every individual has a unique microbiome, if we continue to stay with study designs that are very small, some of the impact that we may have is going to get diluted just because we don't have enough individuals to see the impact because each one is so individual in and of itself. And so there's been a group of us talking about trying to how do we get more studies that are multi-institutional to increase our numbers centered around microbiome based therapeutics, because in order to wash out the individual noise and actually see significant impact, we have to have larger sample sizes in the microbiome space. So I think that that's one big hurdle that vet med, we're starting to discuss and trying to overcome. I think the other part is the fact that right now we've been talking about just who's there and what organisms are modified, but actually what's more important is what function are we gaining when we add a certain organism in. And so I think really the push right now is for microbiome based projects in vet med to get away from just characterizing who's there and really digging into the weeds to get to the mechanism. Because if we understand the mechanism, now all of a sudden we can reach in our toolkit for microbiome and say, wow, this is actually, we could mediate this with diet, or wow, there's actually a postbiotic that if we design this postbiotic, that's all we need for this disease state. And so I think increased numbers within studies is a major component there. And I think that trying to get away from just characterization and more down into mechanism is where we need to go in order to get to the precision piece. But absolutely, I would love by the time I retire that in practice you've got a bedside test that gives you a readout of what that microbiome looks like and what you should be reaching for on your shelf for that patient. I think that would revolutionize what we can do for patients and really change disease landscape, broad spectrum disease, respiratory disease, chronic kidney disease, immune-mediated disease. Like the microbes are part of us. They are impacting all of these things. And I think the more that we start bringing focus into microbiome medicine in our practice, the better we'll be for our patients in the long term.
Absolutely. Well, and not for nothing. Hopefully I'm going to use these terms correctly. I don't have a PhD, so forgive me if I use these incorrectly. But even with these smaller number, kind of prospective studies that you're doing or retrospective, even if they are small numbers and we're changing practices based on studies where it would have been nice to have a larger sample size to like you put it, to cancel out the individual noise, by putting together these smaller sample size studies, I mean, I think it also lends to, it's a little bit like chicken and the egg, because then it sets up for retrospective or meta-analysis and things like this, where we start to have data that we didn't have before, because you are looking at microbiome in these different patients. And then you can take these smaller studies and kind of put them together in a more broad scale analysis to do something like that. So I think, certainly I still see the value in the smaller sample sizes and all of this, but man, will it be cool to put it all together.
100%. The other thing with the small sample size to think about is if in all that noise, you still see an impact,
Right, right.
that's significant, right? So there are cases, I mean, the parvo example with FMT is a big one. We don't have a ton of dogs in the literature, but we know that that makes a big difference, right? And so that's a perfect example. What's harder from a research perspective is when we do studies and we get negative results, or we're not able to link it back to a mechanism. What's challenging for me as a researcher is I don't know if that's because I don't have enough individuals because there's so much individual variation, or because there really isn't something there. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. It does make sense. So when you start to see that positive correlation, then you can say, oh, there really is something here. But on the contrary, if you're not seeing a correlation, then it becomes this question of, well, why is that the case?
Yeah, you got it. So I think that's what makes it challenging in this space is if you see an impact with a small sample size, then great. Like that means that in a real life setting, hopefully you will impact a large population of pets by introducing that microbiome management, whatever it is. But if you in your study didn't see an impact, it doesn't rule out that you could still have one, right? So I think from the science perspective, that's where it makes it challenging is trying to balance small studies, which are, easier to get funded. They're easier for recruitment. We get the results really quickly, usually, versus larger scale projects in order to get into the mechanism piece. And I think you're absolutely right. Combining data sets, and when data sets are publicly available, that makes a huge difference for these meta-analysis for us to combine efforts for sure.
Well, and I'm also thinking that, kind of like you mentioned, this beautiful vision for the future of we have a bedside test where we can assess microbiome and make small adjustments to have a big impact. If even in these small sample sizes, if you have analysis of these different microbiome makeups in these different patients, it's just information that I would imagine is not really easy to get because that's just not something we test on a regular basis. So, even outside the context of a parvo study or an enteropathy or chronic kidney disease or whatever it may be, to say, okay, well, let's take a look at the different microbiome makeups of all of these patients. And I'm probably telling you things that you're like, yes, I know, it's so exciting. We have all this information because you think about this all the time. But as always, when we talk, all these light bulbs are coming on for me. And I'm like, gosh, think of like all the data that is coming together right now and what that really could mean for changes in medicine in the future.
Yeah, and the other thing that's rapidly changing in this space is how to apply AI and other technologies
Right.
to these massive data sets that, some of what also limits us, and this is really getting into the weeds, but like is the statistics of it. So there are statistical tools that we have to address microbial communities, but they're actually not as robust as you would think. They're really good at saying disease and healthy, but we're just now starting to get statistical tools to let us track individuals over time. And so some of what even has limited discovery is just these data sets are huge. We don't have great statistical tools. That's something that's ever changing, which is great. I love the bioinformaticians that are excited to do that. That is not my area of expertise, but also putting AI and using AI to help us look at these patterns and identify them because some of the statistical tools that we have just really has limited our discovery in these efforts.
Sure. Oh my gosh, there's so much. So I love talking about this for a lot of reasons, but I get so excited when we do have these conversations because I see so much opportunity there, which I'm sure is also what fuels a lot of your excitement of look at all of this and the things that will continue to come together over time, and what we'll continue to learn.
Yeah, and one partnership that I've kind of got my eye on as a microbiome scientist who's also a veterinarian is Hills has a partnership with Dr. Huttenhauer's lab, and his lab is one of the workhorses for coming up with new bioinformatic tools. And so I am really excited about the partnership that they have because I think that the more tools that we have that are specific to in the veterinary context are going to be really important for us for making these discoveries. And so I'm really excited to see what's going to come out of that partnership. Already, stuff is starting to trickle out. I think it will really revolutionize what we can do in this space as veterinarians. So I've got my eyes on things that come out of that collaboration.
And as this information continues to come out and we start to learn about how this is clinically applicable, I think it also really changes the conversations that we're having with pet owners around food in the exam room, because that is a really challenging conversation in a lot of cases. Because just like in humans, people are very attached to the choices they make, the foods, the supplements, the treats, things like that, for an infinite number of reasons. But the more information we have, not only about, well, most dogs do well on this diet or not, but in, that nitty-gritty of how things are directly impacting the microbiome. And we can really start to lay out some of the benefits of a balanced diet and making sure that whatever we're feeding is complete and balanced. I think it really changes that exam room conversation as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think honestly, clients are demanding that now, right?
Yeah.
Like they want to know that what they're feeding, not only is it high quality, but that it's based on the science to support the health of their pet, right? And it used to be that clients were only focused on the health of their pet. But I think there are some clients now who are coming in because they are worried about their pet's microbiome, even from early puppyhood and kittenhood, and how what they can do on a daily basis to support a resilient, healthy microbiome. And I think that's where diet plays such a key role in this. And I can't stress that enough. Like, it doesn't matter what who you try to add to the community. If they don't have a good nutrient source, they're not going to take hold. So diet is absolutely the number one modulator of microbiome for sure.
That's a really powerful statement right there. Like, it doesn't matter who you introduce if there's not a good diet kind of forming the basis there, that they're not going to take hold. I think that really paints a picture to say, you know, yeah, we can give probiotics and we can do these different things, but unless we have that foundation correct, then we're not going to have the impact that we're looking for. I know some clients are looking for more confirmational bias of, listen, doc, tell me what I'm feeding is correct. And if you don't, I'm going to be upset about it. I've certainly had those conversations before, but it can be hard to argue against that, even if you don't really feel like what they're feeding is the best diet without the science to back us up. And I think that, you know, there's just, I see like so much support and conversation for the information that clients are demanding, the things that they want to know. Because a lot of times when we're having these conversations, when clients do feel really passionate about what they're feeding, I see a lot of it based on their own personal experiences that they've had with changing their diet and food and things. And I certainly respect that. And I love the idea of being able to support their concerns, their experiences, their goals with science, like you said, evidence-based medicine.
Yep. Yep. And I think that's usually how I lead those challenging conversations is, acknowledging and supporting, what their values are and what their goals are for their pet, because absolutely some of that is anecdotal, right? But it's what they truly feel comfortable with, but also trying to lead with, I'm here to provide you with evidence-based medicine. And so it doesn't necessarily mean that what you're doing is wrong. I just can't tell you it's right because I don't have the evidence, right? Now, there are some situations where that, you know, it gets a little bit more challenging because maybe we do have evidence that's not such a great choice, right? And those conversations sometimes get a little bit harder to have. But I think, again, it's part of developing that relationship with your client and making sure they know that, your job is to provide them with the evidence that we have available, and really at the end of the day, it's their choice what they decide to move forward with.
Well, kind of along these lines with clients feeling sometimes very strongly about what they're feeding. And yes, I've had that conversation many times of it might be fine. I just don't know. The data is not available, whether the company is not making it available or we just don't have the science to say if this is good or bad. Um, what about regulation there? Because so many times we're having this conversation and a pet owner might say, this is what I'm feeding. Is it good or bad? And there's just so many products out there. I mean, we can't keep up with all of them. So, yes, a lot of times I'll say these are the ones that I have evidence on and experience with and that I feel comfortable with. I just don't know about this other one. But are there big points that we should be aware of that might feed into some of that communication around regulation in this market?
Yeah, I get this question a lot. So I think, as veterinarians, we need to be aware that products that go out as probiotics or fiber supplementation or even some of the symbiotic components, they are not required by the FDA or USDA to provide any evidence that they're efficacious for even what they're marketing in. And to even kind of push that further is they're not even really regulated to confirm that what they have on the label is actually in the product. So one of my favorite papers is back during my vet school training. Scott Weiss put out a paper where he tested a whole bunch of probiotics that were available on the market. And he just asked the question, is what I get out of the probiotic, is what I culture out of it, what actually is on the label? And the majority of the products were not as labeled. And these were reputable veterinary products that all of us use, et cetera. And there were some on there that like were ones no one had ever heard of, right? So I think there isn't great regulation in this space. What does that mean for clients, right? It means that I do tend to try and reach for companies that also have provided evidence for their product and the science behind it. Because usually, if companies are willing to invest the time and the effort and the money in order to prove that their product is efficacious, I can trust what's in that label. But there's nothing that regulates a company from writing something on a product and verifying that's actually there or verifying that it's going to have a beneficial effect. And I will say there are so many companies now that are popping up with all these crazy different microbiome medicine products, bacteriophage and some fermented microbial products, all sorts of stuff. And the way I talk to owners about it is unless I have science behind it that shows me where I know how to utilize it in their pet, it probably isn't going to do harm, but it might not be helpful. And just having that conversation with them, I think, is helpful because a lot of them think that if it's being marketed, it's got to be safe and it has to be effective. But that's not the case.
Yes, a lot of times I'll talk to pet owners about these products and say, like you said, it could be good, could be bad, unlikely to cause harm, but maybe not efficacious. And yeah, and go into, I tell them like there's really not a lot of regulation in this space. So I really look for companies that are showing me that they have good internal regulation and they're holding themselves accountable because there's not a lot of external regulation. And that's a broader conversation of, what it takes to get FDA approval and, all the different things that go into it. And there's a lot of nuance to that conversation that I've learned a lot about that I didn't know over the years. It's really interesting. So, not to take away from any products in the nutrition and supplement market, but you really do, like you said, need a product that from a company that's holding itself accountable, that has good internal regulation, is going to make the data available and make sure that the product that they are bringing to the market does what it says it's going to do.
And veterinarians should be empowered to ask companies for that.
Sure.
So if there's a new company that has a probiotic that you've never heard of and your owner's interested in it, you should feel comfortable asking that company to provide that information of, how are they checking that their strains are consistent or, all of that information should be readily available. If it's not, then that should be a big red flag for
Right.
sure.
Yeah, and absolutely. That's definitely another talking point that I bring into the exam room. I say, if I recommend, let's use Hills for example. I say if I have a question, I just pick up the phone and I'm talking to somebody. And that's just not going to be the case with a lot of these companies. And that doesn't necessarily reflect anything about their product, but it does tell me that I can't give you any information because they won't give me the information. And that's not my favorite way to operate when I'm telling you what's going to be best for your pet.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, Janessa, I could sit here for another hour, probably longer than that, and continue to talk about this. And it kills me that we can't do that. But I hope we can again soon because these conversations are so much fun, and you have such a great way of bringing this incredibly complicated topic into this concise way of understanding it where it just makes sense. So thank you so much for joining me. Let's please, please, please do it again sometime.
Yeah, absolutely. It was so much fun. I don't think that I enjoy talking poop with anyone else as much as I do with you. So
You have
thank
no
you.
idea how much that means to me.
Thank you for your enthusiasm in this space. But yeah, I'm really excited for the future of veterinary microbiome medicine. I think we have a lot of amazing researchers in this space in vet med, and I'm excited what we're going to be able to do over the next 20 years.
Absolutely. It's so exciting. Well, I really enjoyed that conversation. I always enjoy my conversations with Dr. Winston. She is just a wealth of knowledge when it comes to the gut microbiome, and I love talking about what the vision for the future looks like and how this could impact our patients' overall health, especially the way we manage chronic diseases in the future. It's so cool, and I love all of the possibilities that this area of research presents. So I hope you guys learned a lot too and enjoyed that conversation. Thank you so much for tuning in. Dr. Winston, thank you for the amazing conversation, and thank you to Hills for making this episode possible. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a 5-star review wherever you get your podcast to help other listeners like you find this and other great content we try to put out there. For more episodes, you can click on the Education tab on the Vetfolio website. And of course, we'd love to hear your input on this talk as well as ideas for topics you'd like to hear from us in the future. You can email me at dvm@vetfolio.com. We can connect on Facebook at Dr. Cassie DVM or on Instagram at Dr. Cassie DVM. And remember, if one animal is better off because of you today, it's a great day.